Hello, and thank you for joining our Teaching for 21st Century webinar brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang. I am your host, Annie Cyrus. Please use the Q&A box on your screen if you have any questions, or on Facebook if you're watching live. And I promise you we will get to answer them as soon as our very special guest's presentation is over. With that being said, it is my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, Bruce Thornton. He's a professor at the California State University in Fresno. He's an author of 10 books. He's a Shellman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and he's also a research fellow at Stanford Hoover Institution. Hello, Bruce.
Hello, thanks for having me.
It is always a privilege to hear your wisdom and your thoughts. On that note, floor is yours.
Thank you again for inviting me and everybody for coming. I'm thinking about all of the issues that we're facing today. And I also thought about the fact that this year, 2021, will mark 50 years that I've been in the university as a student, as a graduate student, as a part-timer, or the fancy word is adjunct, as a department chairman, which forced me to see behind the curtain of what goes on with the administration. And what I can tell you, the simple takeaway is that everything, all the nonsense we're dealing with now, the woke stuff, everything, the critical race theory, the systemic racism, everything we're dealing with now was going on in the university by the early 70s. So the first thing to remember is none of this is new. This has all been incubated in the university. Well, how did it break out of its Wuhan lab? Generation after generation of students, and I've witnessed this, standards started slipping. Requirements started easing. Curricula started changing. Not at once, but over time. And what we have to remember when we start talking about, the universities is, let's remember, universities teach the people who teach K through 12 students. In other words, big, the high-end universities, I don't think do a lot of teacher credentialing. That's the state across the country, the state colleges and universities. That's one of our big functions, is the credential program. So, and this sends this teaches the teachers of K through 12. So everything they learn, they've learned from people who learned what they know from the research universities and all the fads and all the politicization and all the nonsense that's cooked up there. So it's a trickle-down degradation of education. And this isn't just abstract. I confirmed it back in the 90s when my two sons were in school. I would go into the classroom, and if you have kids in school, tell them you just want to help the teacher out and volunteer, and that gives you cover for spying on what's going on, which is what I was doing. And I could see in types of curriculum on what was put up on the walls, posters that were put up on the walls, overhearing some of what was going on. I could see these ideas. For example, all the critical race theory people, trying to defend, say, well, if you criticize us, that's because you don't want slavery and Jim Crow and all of these racist institutions to be taught. When I was an undergraduate in the early 70s, I had an American history course. Half of what we did was about slavery. The textbooks that were assigned were about slavery. And this had begun in American history probably in the 50s. And it had started to reach the university history courses. So to say that we want to hide the history of slavery, we don't want to talk about the history of slavery. All we've done for half a century is talk about slavery and the history of slavery. And it's a complete lie to say that this topic has been swept under the rug or hidden or whatever. What has happened is how it's taught. That's what's changed. The ideology that shapes how it is taught. And I have a way to compare that, because at UCLA I had an African-American history course. I had Black history. Black was the Black history. And fortunately, it was a good class because the professor, who was Black, was first and foremost a historian. I don't know about his personal life, but in the classroom, he was a historian, not an activist. He was saying, here's some stuff that's good to know. And it was a very useful class. So all of this was going on 50 years ago, 45 years ago. What has happened is the profession of history was contaminated and debased by a lot of ideas, many of them emanating from Marxist ideology, such as Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. Zinn was a card-carrying communist, as they said back in the 50s. And his book was a work of propaganda that complemented his outreach to particularly the Black community. In other words, American communists, they saw the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s as a way to get in with the Black community and, you know, present their Marxist ideology. So the other problem, all right, problem number one, Marxism, obviously. You don't need me to tell you that, you know that. But there's something interesting to keep in mind. The other dimension of this corrupt history is the history of colonialism and imperialism. This goes hand in hand with critical race theory. And that focus did not come from Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx couldn't care less about colonial peoples or imperial peoples. Why? Because his scientific history meant that peoples have to go through that cycle of economic systems. These, you know, more primitive people, they needed to go become industrialized, become bourgeois, and then create a proletariat that will become more and more immiserated until they rise up against their capitalist masters and overthrow them. And in fact, after the Mexican War of 1846, 1848, when the Southwest was ceded to the United States by Mexico as part of the resolution of some of the reasons for the war, or if you're on the left, you say we stole it from them. But Marx wrote in the New York, he was a reporter, freelance reporter for the New York Herald. He said, the United States stole California from the lazy Mexicans who didn't know what to do with it, right? Because they weren't developing an industrial economy. In California, or what is known as Alta California before it became United States, there wasn't a single factory in Alta California. There wasn't a single school. There wasn't a single printing press. It was a basically feudal, almost medieval culture. So for Marx, it's like, no, you know, your destiny is not this. So they didn't really care about it. So what happened? What happened was the crisis of Marxism at the 19th century. And what was that? Everything that Marx predicted would happen, I just sketched out, right? From industrialization to revolution, wasn't happening. It didn't happen. It was supposed to be scientific history, scientific socialism. It wasn't a philosophy of history. It wasn't, you know, a abstract scholarly exegesis. This was scientific, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. And it didn't happen because as capitalism developed through the 19th century, it's realized, all these robber baron plutocrats and these horrible oppressive capitalists realized that it was in their interest to improve the lot of their workers, because then they become their consumers. And the great example of this is Henry Ford. He doubled for his factory workers the hourly wage, which was unprecedented at the time. And why? Why should I just sell, why can't I sell, you know, more Model Ts to more and more people by giving them the means to do that? It wasn't altruism, it wasn't Christian charity, it was just cold, hard calculation. You don't want to immiserate your workers. You want to make them prosperous so they can buy more products. And that's exactly what happened in England. It's what happened in this country. So what was one of the solutions to this issue? England, the British Empire, at the end of the 19th century, because of the Boer War, 1898 to I think 1901, it was a really nasty affair. That's the first time that you see the phrase concentration camps. It was brutal, and it wasn't against, you know, savages who needed Christianity and civilizing. It was against the European colonists, the Boers. And it was about gold, and it was about diamonds, and it left a bad taste in everybody's mouth. And that's really where you begin to see a turning away from the empire on the part, particularly of the intelligentsia in England. So in 1907, I believe, there was a book that came out that made this argument that basically imperialism was just a racket. It wasn't about the white man's burden. It wasn't about bringing the light of civilization and Christianity to the heathen. It was just a racket. About 9 years later, 1916, I believe, Vladimir Lenin wrote a book, Imperialism, Capitalism's Last Phase. So if the proletariat, the European proletariat and factory workers weren't going to play their assigned role in this historic drama, the colonialized people will. That's where Marxism will find its traction for attacking the capitalist or social democratic, you know, economies and cultures of Europe. So that entered into the left's repertoire. And after World War II and the stance against imperialism that the United States took, okay, they now could take this idea of colonialism and imperialism as oppressive capitalist institutions. Let's pause and enjoy the irony of this. Because in the 19th century, you may have heard this expression, the great game. That was the tournament, right, between England, the British Empire, and the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, over Central Asia. All the stands, Turkestan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. The Mongol Khanates, they were called. And that was a big white spot in the map. And what did the British care? They cared about India. And many of the entry places into India from the north, Russia, came through that territory. So they wanted to establish relations. They didn't want to conquer them and colonize them or do anything but bribe their chieftains to do what they wanted to do. The same attitude they had towards Afghanistan. So they had this debate, this struggle, which Russia eventually won. And they became part of the Russian Empire. So in 1917, when you had the Bolshevik Revolution, to liberate the oppressed, did they turn those territories back to their indigenous populations? No, they became part of the Soviet empire. And they didn't stop being a part until the Soviet Union collapsed due to mainly Britain and the United States. So to see Marxists now talking about imperialism, right, and colonialism, Marxist theory in its classic form didn't care anything about that. But it was useful because in the 50s, you started to get this interpretation that the ethnic minorities, particularly in the United States, and particularly Black people, were internal colonial peoples. And their struggle could then become part of the larger Marxist struggle now, as was happening in Africa, where the Soviet Union, and the Middle East too, they trained the PLO, don't forget, the KGB did, that they could then do that with these so-called internal colonial peoples as a way of undermining the United States and fomenting division. So all of that then ended up in the universities. And then you begin to see all of this talk about colonialism and imperialism and how evil they were and how bad and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. This is what you see if you follow the Israeli-Palestinian Arab conflict and the history of Israel. What did they start saying about Israel right after World War? It's a colonial outpost of the West. This is a part of Western imperialism, Western colonialism. They still use that in their rhetoric. It's amazing because there was never a British or an American colony, never been colonized between Egypt and the Turkish Peninsula. Why? This belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And why did the Ottoman Empire lost it? Because they made an incredible geopolitical blunder by joining the Axis, the Central Powers in World War I. Why? Because they had a relationship with Germany. Germany was training their army. Germany was, helping them to modernize. Okay. So that's the problem. It's not colonialism. It was imperialism, but it was Ottoman imperialism who were the controlling authority in those territories. And after the war, and they lost, and then Kemal Ataturk disbanded the caliphate and wanted to fashion the nation of Turkey on the modern Western sort of model of nation states to reduce the influence of Islam, et cetera. That was about 100 years ago, and you can ask yourself, how's that going right now in Turkey? How successful has that effort been under Erdogan? So it's nothing to do with imperialism. It's anytime you hear imperialism and colonialism, you're hearing propaganda. It's a meaningless term. It's like fascist. It no longer means what it originally meant. So all of that starts to converge in the university. The next thing that happened, and I was really, really in the middle of this, the expansion and fashion of theory, like critical race theory. A lot of it from the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxists, right? And remember, their response to the crisis of Marxism, in addition to colonialism and imperialism, was it's not on the factory floor where we're going to win. It's in the culture. It's in the schools, right? If you can get control of the schools, you get them at 5 years old, and then you have them for another 12 years, or maybe even 16 years. Or if you go to graduate school, maybe 20 years or 18 years. And what we're seeing now is exactly the success of that strategy. So theory came along as a sort of idiot cousin of Marxism. And by theory, I mean the philosophers, most of them French, but not all. Some were German, like Herbert Marcuse, Frankfurt School. This was Jacques Derrida, Ferdinand Saussure, especially Michel Foucault. especially Michel Foucault. Right? And why I, who was a traditionalist scholar of Greek and Latin literature and English literature, and was writing a dissertation that my advisors keep telling me, oh, you know, this is traditional. You're not going to get a job because everybody wants, you know, everybody wants post-structuralism, postmodernism. So I'm in a program called comparative literature. Since I'm working with literature, it made sense. But I didn't realize till I was in the program, it was the hotbed, not English departments, although they were being, you know, taken over by this too, as were social sciences, history, et cetera. But it was really comparative literature where this was the big thing. This was the big thing. And I had to take courses in some of this stuff. And I knew it was a load of crap. So to make sure that I could back up such a statement, I began to read this stuff. And I began to write scholarly articles about how terrible they have been for the study of classics of Greek and Latin literature. But what you saw was the radical idea that everything is a construct of power. History, literature, all these things. Now, you listen, you'll start hearing where systemic racism comes from. It may look on the surface that there's improvement and that there's been civil rights gains and that there's been civil rights successes. But below that is the reality created and manipulated by power to suit itself. So everything has to be attacked. Everything has to be deconstructed. Was the term in doing this was literature, and then was adopted. So this is where we begin to hear, and I remember back in the 90s, they were already laying the groundwork for transgenderism. I wrote an article called Freak Sex and the Construction of Sexuality, the Foucauldian construction of sexuality. And that was in 91, I think, 92, right? A little scholarly journal that nobody would read, but nonetheless, it was an issue. And what they're saying is there's no biological natural male, natural female. These are all arbitrary constructs created by power to legitimize their oppression, mainly of women at that point. Radical feminism was really hot on this. So I was seeing this, and believe me, if you'd come back 30 years ago and said, pretty soon this is going to be a national phenomenon with medical doctors violating their medical oath, their Hippocratic oath to do no harm, mutilating and poisoning minor children, I would have thought, no, I mean, that's not going to happen. That's exactly what happened. That's what came of this bad idea. And that's why I said it's bad ideas. They're zombie ideas because they're so old, they're dead, but they're still walking around causing mischief. So all of these fads that we're, having to experience, right? Today, they have their origins in universities. Now, let me see I'm sorry, I got to keep track of the time. Okay, one last point, and then we'll have some questions. So that's one of the things I learned as a student. That's what I saw happening. And over the subsequent years, I did a lot of writing, books and articles about how these things were playing out in the larger culture. But also, as a department chair, I encountered some of the federal laws that has aided and abetted this transformation over the years. And this is a critically important point. Our tax dollars over the years have paid for a lot of these bad ideas and their spread. And it's through federal law, particularly federal anti-discrimination laws, civil rights laws, Title IX, for example, because and take sexual harassment law. As a sort of administrator, I mean, my faculty, and I had a couple of women that had a complaint against a colleague. And so they had to meet with me, and I heard them out, and I said, doesn't sound like sexual harassment to me. And they were both Spanish professors, and the colleague was a aristocratic native of Mexico, who didn't think much of his colleagues. And he said, well, you know, you'd have to be familiar with Mexican culture of Mexico to understand. I said, look, if you can't explain it to me, how are you going to explain it to the investigator? Or if it goes to litigation, to a jury or a judge or whatever. I mean, come on. Well, I was called in by the investigator, a good guy, and we talked, and I said, Eddie, this is nothing but a intra-office squabble among faculty, right? They're fighting over something. And these two faculty are using sexual harassment law as leverage, as a weapon, right? To further whatever it is they want and weaken whom they think is causing it. And he said, you think I don't know that? I said, of course it is. All these things we look at, it's nothing to do with feeling up somebody in a mail room or saying, hey, you know, I'll vote for your promotion if we date or anything like that. It has nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with that. And remember the language of sexual harassment. Anything that a protected class, what's a protected class? Women, ethnic minorities, not all, Sikhs and Hindus, which we have a lot here in the Central Valley, they don't really count. Black, Latino, eventually gay, that they feel creates a hostile and intimidating workplace. A hostile and intimidating workplace. Now, what is that? That's going to be whatever that person says it is. One of these women actually told me, because I asked for examples, well, what has he done? And I'm thinking, you know, the guy's been leching on you or perving on you or something. Well, you know, our mailroom's small, and he comes in wearing this overpowering cologne. I said, oh, wait, I'm sorry, that doesn't sound like an actionable, you know, you don't like the guy's cologne. I mean, that's, but this was how silly it was getting. So they could reach those criteria. And remember, it works not because they're actually going to win anything. They're going to trigger an investigation, which the school has to do because it doesn't want to be liable, right? It doesn't want to be liable and have the feds come in. And they change behavior. And remember, it's all about power, and power is all about making people do what you want them to do. And that's really what it was about. Not that there wasn't legitimate, when I was an undergraduate, if there had been sexual harassment law then, half the professors wouldn't have spouses, right? That's where they found them, among their graduate students. So that obviously, you know, that obviously happens, but it has been corrupted. And then the final point to all this is, remember, the corruption caused by federal money. What's the leverage the feds have for all of these issues? The money they give to universities, including private universities. And it's in billions and billions and billions of dollars. And they can withhold that money. They can say, look, you do this, as Barack Obama did when he set the unconstitutional protocols for adjudicating on campus claims of sexual assault, right? Trump changed them and went back to constitutional ones. They're going to be changed back to where they were before, because you can only do it by regulatory advice as the chief executive, all right? So they have that letter. It said, you don't do what we want you to do, you're not going to get your research money, which I believe the institution takes about half of as, you know, carrying charges or whatever. They now took over under Obama the student loan industry, so they control that. And the universities don't want to lose all of those billions of dollars, so they play ball with the Fed's regulations. So that money keeps going. Right? And whether it violates the Constitution, whether it destroys the true mission of the university, which is lost, I'll tell you right now, pretty much with some exceptions is lost and is failing, it doesn't matter. They can continue to grow. They get more administrators, right? Diversity offices with 100 faculty, 100 administrators and secretaries and all the whole, you know, computers, all that. And that's why the administrative apparatus in all universities over the last 30 years has increased immensely in ratio to, or in proportion to faculty. So those are what I learned just being there for 50 years. And I think we need to keep in mind when we're seeing what's happening and we want to say, well, what can we do about it? What can we do about it? Well, you can't fire a tenured faculty member, all right? You know, and you can't do anything about whom they hire or how they are trained in graduate programs, but we can do something if we get true conservative Republicans again in power. They can go back and revisit some of these laws and regulations and change them to make them less corrupt. Right? Last point, one thing you can do, when you have a university like Stanford, Harvard, Yale, and they have $1 billion endowment, why are they getting 1 penny of our tax dollars? Why? Right? Instead of building that new gigantic multi-million-dollar building, you pay for the unrepresented, those who have been oppressed, those who have been excluded. You pay their way to come here instead of the American taxpayers. So obviously could go on like forever, but I'm sure you wouldn't appreciate that. And, well,
actually, Bruce, I think everybody would. However, we do have questions piling up, so I will take this opportunity to keep our promise to our audience. Before I start reading the questions from our audience, first question goes to me. What is the end game, Bruce?
Well, the end game, we're living through the end game. The end game is that the university, the schools, K through 12, university, everything, graduate, everything is going to continue to corrupt and metastasize, as it has done, into journalism, right, into government, everywhere else. That's what's going to happen. What's the end game from our perspective? It's political. It's political. People have to hold the establishment Republicans' feet to the fire and not they can get away with what they've been doing since World War II. And that's halfway supporting the progressive agenda of the Democrats, the redistribution of state, the bloated entitlements that are going to bankrupt us. That could be another end game if we start going broke, and then changes would have to be made. But our option is politics. And real quickly, I just read before we started, and you may know this, on that Schumer is cooking up this infrastructure bill, right? What is it, $1.6 trillion, like Dr. Evil, $1 trillion. And he's got 10 Republican senators who will support it. They've stopped it now because there's no bill yet. But when they write the bill and they go back again, they have 10. What are they thinking? They're giving the Democrats a gift, as well as furthering the bankruptcy of our country with these programs. And this is what we've got to do. We've got to hold these people's feet to the fire, you know, and it's hard to do.
But that does not mean we should give up. As Robert
Ever.
Spencer always says, it is not over until it's over, and it is not over.
Nah,
Okay.
it never is. Not when there's an election every 2 years. Here's the brilliance of our Constitution. There's an election every 2 years. There's always a way for us, we the people, to say, nah, we had enough.
We the people. Okay. I could definitely talk to you for another 2.5 hours about that one comment, but here's a question. The question was asked anonymously, so I don't know the name. It says, Bruce, please tell us who the woke are. Are they true believers who sincerely want to create a just society, or are they useful idiots who are manipulated by propagandists? Are they opportunists who see a career path to money and power?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. That's a great question, because it's something, one of the things that I learned over the years that I didn't mention, but that you brought up, is I began to see that a lot of these people that, you know, proclaimed all this postmodernism and all this other stuff, it was about opportunism. It was about careerism. All right. I have no doubt that the leadership of BLM is about making money, which they have done. Right? $90 million that nobody seems to know what happened. Even people who are members of BLM don't know what happened. And that's exactly what it's about. They adopted, look, what I noticed as a graduate student, there was the inner kind of core, the teaching assistants, right? And I was one. And they were, you know, back then it was, you know, Ronald Reagan's the devil, the Sandinistas are wonderful, blah, 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 you know, Nicaragua is heaven. But anyway, and they would say all of this postmodern stuff. And then you'd see them at some faculty party or some, you know, graduate student party with faculty. And these women that had their khaki fatigues on and their, you know, Clash buttons and their Che Guevara hat, they've got their, you know, cocktail dress on and their high heels, and they're schmoozing with the faculty, and because they need a good recommendation, because that's how it works, right? It's that recommendation from your PhD committee and everything. The second thing I noticed from the in addition to the opportunists, were the, let's say, indifferent. And what they do is they conform to their environment, okay? They conform to their environment. They didn't really have any strong political positions one way or the other, but they saw how the more vocal graduate students were talking and how their professors talked. And it's like, well, this is the job I want to have. So I guess this is the way, if you get this job, this is the way you're supposed to talk. And they started adopting these positions and saying these things and repeating them. That is, repeating what they heard somebody else say. They don't really believe. And then, and I think this is the smallest cohort, there are the true believers. They're the true believers. They really believe it. Fortunately, I don't think they are the majority. I don't think they're a majority. And they're generally very, very badly educated, because no one who's not badly educated would ever endorse or accept these obviously preposterous propositions, such as systemic racism, which has no empirical evidence whatsoever. You couldn't go into a courtroom and bring evidence put before a jury because it just doesn't exist. It's just an abstract propaganda bunch of phrases. That's a great question. Thank you.
Agreed. That was a good question. Okay. Here's a question from Stephen Mix. Says, Marxist countries seems to be extremely harsh, but non-traditional morals, like childbirth outside of marriage, fluid genders, etc. Is all these woke stuff just a Marxist weapon against our society? And also, won't these leftists suffer greatly in the end at their hands, being the Marxist hand, when the Marxists destroy them as corruption of the new utopia?
Well, again, good question. And this is actually the Marxizing of sexuality, the clumsy phrase, but this is what happened. And Herbert Marcuse was one of them. And what in the 60s, we had the hippie movement, right? The hippie movement wasn't a Marxist movement. It was just, we don't like rules. We don't want anybody telling us what to do. We want to do what we want to do, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, all right? And it was very attractive. And there was something kind of American about it in the sense that, you know, think of Huck Finn. Remember Huck Finn? The old lady, Miss Watson, he's an orphan. I want to send him to school. I want him to stop smoking his pipe. I want him to wear shoes. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. And he heads out for the territories. He goes to the frontier where there's the wide open spaces where you can sort of do what you want. That's part of the American character. And what was the genius of the New Left, the cultural Marxism, was to see that they could hijack that and use it as an entree into, or a recruiting tool into their ideology. And what they did was said, hey, what you guys are doing is part of the revolution. You're fighting against authority. What's the best way to challenge the capitalist, hegemony? Free love, right? Abortions, all that stuff. So that was absolutely became part of that whole anti-authoritarian movement. Now, if I understood the question correctly, it seems like that eventually those kinds of mores will destroy culture. There's never been a hedonistic culture that can survive. It just can't, unless it's Switzerland, or Luxembourg or something like that. But a consequential power, a world power, it can't survive those levels of amorality or hedonism. And even if it's Marxist, it won't last. But I think you're right that if it starts to challenge, if they created a Marxist regime, even a socialist Marxist regime, right, you might see them try to rein in some of this hedonism that has become so ingrained in our culture. It's on every TV channel, it's everywhere. Because they know that eventually it will destroy any type of culture. So they might exploit it in the beginning, masquerading, their revolution as one that's also a revolution against drug laws, against sexual behavior, etc. But in the end, it will destroy them.
Agreed, and this is kind of relevant but irrelevant. But me and you, Bruce, on last time you were on, we discussed this. It doesn't matter which tool or weapon is being used. Socialist, communist, Marxist, Islamist, they all operate on the same format, which is basically lie at first, crawl into the society, expand your followers, the useful idiots, then gain momentum, gain power, and overthrow.
Yeah.
That's
exactly.
Pretty much every corner you look. Now, here's my question for you, though, Bruce. With Islam, I know the answer. But the rest of them, you said this is all about power and money. And I agree completely. But why do they have to burn America down, which is the best country that exists with the most perfect constitution ever? Why can't they make their power and money without having to destroy America? Where is that hatred, that common goal of taking America down come from? Where's that at?
Well, what's easier? To gather in a mob and riot and burn some stuff, or to work on some innovation that you can create and market, or to develop skills that have a market value out in the real world, why not infiltrate public institutions, schools and government, right? Because schools and government aren't directly responsible to the market the way a private business is. Private business can only go so far until they start losing money. The government can go on forever. Universities can go on forever. There is no accountability for their failure. We've been witnessing it for the last 5 or 6 years with what happened at the DOJ and the FBI. Who in the FBI has been held accountable for what they did to the Trump campaign and to the Trump administration? Why isn't James Comey, on a chain gang in Georgia chopping cotton or something? There's no accountability. They can blow through money, spend it, and they'll just make more. So they gravitate to those venues, you see. And when they need violence to gain traction, to gain attention, to gain leverage, right, then they do. It's like it's like asking, why the mafia? Why does the mafia use violence? Because nobody stops them. If nobody stops them, they'll continue to do it. And this last year, what we saw, nobody wanted to stop them. Although I noticed the other day was in Portland. Did you see this footage? Some Antifa clowns sprayed silly string at this cop, and he shot him in the abdomen with a rubber bullet. And another two, these guys were grappling with him. They took their batons out and they started tuning them up. And I said, finally, you guys finally figuring out? Because you look at these guys aren't hardcore gangster types that are doing this. All right, they're college students. They're probably come from at least middle class, and many of them upper middle class. And that's what's interesting about this. This is a phenomenon of the university trained, right? Whatever their race. We're not looking at the hardcore downtrodden in the inner cities rising up as we saw in the 60s, sort of. No. So they figure, why should I go and have a job and actually work and actually be trained to do something that's useful when I can do this? Basically act like a child all the time and get rewarded for it.
That's just, I don't know. Part of me just wants to say what a lot of people say. You want communism? There are communist countries. Just go live there. You want Islam? Go to Islamic countries. Like, leave us alone. Yeah. We love the way America is.
Yeah.
We say, you go.
Remember something Dostoevsky said. Man is an ungrateful animal. And in his brilliant novella, Notes from Underground, the character he calls Underground says, look, you could build the Crystal Palace. You could have people live there with nothing to do but procreate and eat cakes. And some guy would stand up and pick up a rock and say, let's destroy all this perfection. It's in our nature. I would say, from my belief, our fallen nature, right? Our fallen nature that can't be improved, not materially, not through science, not because it's a spiritual condition. And in the end, what we come down to is what we're dealing with is a spiritual crisis. But we kind of don't want to say that because, well, then you're some sort of religious nut or something. But even there are atheists who say this and admit this, that you can't pull the transcendent supports out from under a culture and then not expect it to start falling to pieces. Because people will do whatever they think they can get away with doing. And that's really the larger context for what's happening. And that's secularism. That's a whole culture starting in the 19th century, gradually accelerating after World War II. When a culture decides we don't need God, right? Okay, look, go to church, but that's private. That's private. You can go to church. Good, go to church. But The real power is not going to answer to any spiritual imperative. And I don't know how is that going to happen? How is that going to change? History doesn't show us any easy way in which that gets corrected. And that's what's really, really troubling about our predicament.
I 100% agree. It is definitely, I would say we the people, Americans, we have waited a little too much to start doing something about it. So every day we wait, it's one extra step added to reverse the damage. Here's a question from Michael.
Right.
It seems like a big part of the problem is we have more propagandists than we do teachers or professors. How do we get these political activists removed from the classroom so they can't do any more damages?
Well, that's tough because again, we're like federal workers. The problem is we have two layers of protection. We have tenure, right? And we have a union. Federal workers, they have civil service law and they have a union. These unions are powerful. They give politicians lots of money. They run, in a sense, California, right? The K through 12 unions. So they're very entrenched. So it takes a long time. It takes a long time to corrupt, learning to end where we are. So you can't just, wipe out everybody that's there and replace them with others. You have to start transforming it, school by school. You know what I mean? And one of the most important causes that should be supported is school choice. School choice terrifies the teachers' unions because they know if they have school choice, they have competition. If they have competition, they're done because they fail. Now, I want to say something. My son's a high school teacher. There are a lot of good teachers working in America today. I would say probably the majority of them are, right? But they are good teachers in spite of the university and the training that they were subjected to, not because of it. So you need to reform, get school choice, break the monopoly that the education schools have over credentialing, right? There's no science of teaching. That's preposterous. There's no science of teaching that they teach, and so people can go and be good teachers. No, it's all just nonsense, most of it. And you know who tells me that all the time? The poor students who are in the credential programs. I say, can you believe this? They're saying this? I said, yeah, I believe it, of course. So that's one thing you can do. Provide alternatives. I think homeschooling movement has been important for this. And perhaps this whole lockdown Nazism that the schools have been imposing, maybe people will start, even some self-proclaimed progressive people, like over in Marin County, they're getting all, they want to get rid of their school board for some of this stuff. But that's how that has to happen. And it's going to be a long process, right, of creating a critical mass of people who haven't been brainwashed. And then you go on up the food chain, to universities. But it's a hard problem. There's no doubt about it, right? They're like ticks, they're just burrowed in to the body politic, and it's very difficult to get rid of them.
Well, thank you for explaining that. We are almost out of time, so let me try to squeeze one or two more questions in there. This question says, where do you think this culture comes from? Now, the question is referring to the group thinking socialist culture.
Right.
Their guess is it's coming from Germany because this person has experienced it in Germany, but where do you think this culture comes from?
Yeah, absolutely. The late 19th century, where we begin to see progressivism develop in this country. Okay, and as I said recently in a column, progressivism is a kissing cousin of Marxism. All right, and Bismarck's achievement in uniting all those petty German states into a nation, and not just a nation, but an industrial power that defeated the French in 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, and stole Alsace and Lorraine, right? And they had a social sort of security system, right? Big government aid to people. They were the model. And Woodrow Wilson and all these other progressives, they went to graduate school in Germany and Heidelberg. They picked those ideas up and they brought them back to the United States. So that's true. The German influence, particularly the Prussian German influence on particularly education. I mean, John Dewey just single-handedly laid down the predicates for destroying American education. And, you know, he was a big fan. He saw it too. But they also were socialists, communists, and of course, they believe in progress. They believe in utopia. And the really clever thing about Marxism is it presented itself as progress, as a process that leads to heaven on earth, right? You know, Marx's famous statement, you know, once the state withers away and the people own the means of production, a man will get up in the morning and write a poem and then do a little work and then he'll go play his flute or something. We'll be in paradise. And of course, it's the exact opposite. It's the exact opposite. But it's very attractive to people. People want to believe that, you know, there's a better world that we're heading towards. That's what faith used to provide people. But as people began losing their faith, Chesterton is supposed to have said this, but I'm not sure he actually did. So when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing, he believes in anything. And Marxism was one of the anythings that people started believing in. It gave them what they thought was a moral framework. These are the sheep, these are the goats, these are the oppressors, these are the noble revolutionaries. This is the end point of our struggle, right? Where all of the evils and ills of human experience since it began is going to go away. And that's not possible. Because again, and we're back to the spiritual problem, it's not possible because we are not capable of perfection, because we are flawed, fallen human beings. And the question is not whether or not we will sin, it's when we will, which is going to be pretty much always. So in the attempt to create this by using power, we know what happened in the Soviet Union, right? You know that some French scholars tallied up the toll of communist victims, not counting in war, 100 million people in the 20th century, right? That was the butcher's bill for that big, nice omelet that Walter Duranty said, you know, hey, you got to break some eggs to make an omelet. You know, they broke 100 million eggs, and what did they have, right? So, again, we circle back, like Jean Saki, we circle back to the problem of, this is a spiritual problem, right? You know, those are the hardest problems to try to resolve.
And to be honest, Bruce, from life experience, I can tell you this. It doesn't matter where you're at, doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter your skin color, your religion, lack of it, there is as long as there are oppressed people, there will be oppressors. The end of the day, those who give in to the abuse end up creating this delusion of systematic this and that. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a few countries, such as my motherland, that there is a systematic abuse. But again, if my fellow Iranians weren't so worried about staying alive, even if it means living in presence of the Islamic regime, if they wouldn't worry about that, they would have finalized this so-called uprising and revolution, set themselves free. So no matter which country we talk about, at the end of the day, we, the people of that nation, are failing themselves.
This has always been the dilemma, hasn't it? And I would add to that, particularly for this country and the West in general, we are so incredibly rich. We're so rich, we don't know how rich we are. In the context of history, of what humans used to live on, what their lives were like, those people today that we define as poor, right? They live better material existence than the king of Spain in the 15th century, right? He may have been drinking from a golden chalice, but his intestines were full of parasites, and he was probably going to die, before he was 45. And what happens is that we get used to that, and we think that's all life is about. Life is about having stuff and having comfort and being comfortable, and then we cling to it. Look at this incredible hysteria the past year over a virus that was killing people who were already dying. It was amazing. You didn't see that in 1918, the Spanish flu. You didn't see such hysteria because they lived in a harder world where they kind of, this stuff happens. In the real world, this is what happens. But many of us live in a kind of artificial world. And eventually it's unsustainable. If only economically it's going to be unsustainable.
Very true. Unfortunately and sadly, Bruce, we are out of time. So please do tell our audience where can they go to follow your work and get more familiar with you.
Of course, Front Page Magazine. I'm there once a week at least. And several of the books I've done cover a lot of some sort of these issues. And if you can find one available. But yeah, a Front Page, because there's a whole bunch of good people on Front Page, by the way.
Agreed.
Oh, yeah, they have a great
man and woman.
Great stable, yeah.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your information. Hang in there, stay strong, and keep on fighting.
Thank you, and thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. And to our lovely audience who stayed with us until now, we appreciate you very much. And I want to remind you, these webinars are brought to you by the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Glazov Gang for free. So if you want to support these webinars, all you got to do is go to frontpagemag.com and consider making a 100% tax-deductible donation. With that being said, stay safe and goodbye.